Hey everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here, coming to you from the intersection of Southwest Market and First Street. Now, if you saw the episode I posted, my last one I posted, I delved into the murder of Freda Guarascia, which I'm amazed I can't even remember her name because I did that video almost 2 months ago. And if you watch the video, you'll note that she was murdered by an obsessed love interest, if you can even call it that, a guy named Frank Guglielmo. And you'll note I visited this exact location because there used to be a saloon. I don't know what corner it was at, but there was a saloon located on one of the corners of this street, and I actually found out it was called the Sunnyside Saloon. And one of the reasons potentially that Frank Guglielmo was working at this saloon is that it was family owned. And what I mean by that is a couple years before Frank Guglielmo committed his murder of somebody else, his father was murdered in the same saloon. I didn't find this out till like a month after I did that first video, and I was like, huh, Guglielmo again. It doesn't sound like that common of a name, so I figured there's got to be a connection. And yeah, so for this story, we're coming back to this same location I was at, where I mentioned that Frank Guglielmo worked. And in this case, it's Christmas Day, which is really tragic, 1902, in a fresh episode of Historic Murders of Portland. Alright, so let's set the stage here. Now, Frank Guglielmo was an Italian immigrant. This area, Portland State is just off this way. This was where a lot of Portland's Italian immigrants live. This is kind of the Little Italy area. If you go up by Portland State University and you see there's that church that's still there, it's a really old church. And that is one of the last remaining pieces that actually ties back to the original Little Italy of Portland, because so much of this area was demolished in the 1950s and 1960s as Portland tried to pursue urban renewal, and a lot of the housing and buildings here were really blighted, and they just knocked everything over. That's why you don't really find many buildings in this area that are more than 50, 60 years old. So this was rife with Portland's Italian populace. So the saloon that would have been at this intersection probably mostly had Italian clientele. And for the sake of our story, now the newspapers say it was approximately 1 a.m. So I don't know if that means it had just gone from Christmas Eve into Christmas, or if it was just a little after midnight and they're just saying it's still Christmas, but it was really December 26th. I'm hoping they would have some journalistic integrity, and so when they say it's 1 a.m., it means Christmas just started. So I'm going to go with that. I'm just going to assume Christmas was 1 hour old. Most of the kids are home in bed. I don't know how many of them were doing the whole Santa Claus thing. I don't know how big the whole giving presents thing was back in 1902 compared to how it is now, but whatever the case, the kids are home nestled in their beds while some guy named Joseph Nicastro is walking around, not with sugar plums dancing on his head, but with a knife in his pocket. This is really cheesy. But you see where I'm going for. So just a little bit after midnight, presumably early hours of Christmas morning, this guy Joseph Nicastro walks into the Sunnyside Saloon that Joe Guglielmo, Frank Guglielmo's father, is the proprietor of, so he's calling the shots here. So the place is apparently hustling and bustling a little bit because it's 1902 and most people are poor. So I mean, what better way to rein in the Christmas season than to get drunk right out of the gate? So, everything's going naturally the way things would go at a saloon. People are getting drunk. People are probably talking about what's going on in their lives, now everything kind of sucks. And Joseph Nicastro comes in. He's already drunk. He's already belligerent. And apparently he was known in the area for being a guy that would get drunk, get pissed, and start fighting people or breaking stuff. So he comes in, waddles in off the street, goes up to this cigar machine. It was a cigar machine inside the saloon. Puts a coin in. The machine won't dispense his cigar. So he's getting pissed. He's yelling at the machine. He's hitting it. Joe Guglielmo's there behind the bar. It's his joint. You don't mess with a man's cigar machine. And how many lives have to end because a vending machine malfunctioned? So Joe Guglielmo comes out from behind the bar. He's trying to calm this guy down. Hey, you know, Nicastro's starting to punch the machine. He's like, "This is a piece of crap. Your joint sucks." So they're kind of they're exchanging words. Joseph Nicastro is not calming down. And finally, Joe Guglielmo pauses and is just kind of like, okay, how about I just give you a free beer and we call it even? You know, for the price of the cigar you lost, I will give you a beer. So they get Nicastro to sit down. They give him his beer, which is probably not going to help his state of mind. And you think he's going to calm down, but even as he's sitting at the bar drinking his beer, he's still taking cheap shots at the cigar machine. And it's getting to a point where he's just so pissed. And all the patrons in the bar are even trying to calm him down, like, dude, chill, it's Christmas, come on. And finally, just Joe Guglielmo had enough. He walks out again, grabs Nicastro, and just throws him out. I mean, how many times has that had to happen? Saloons, bars, taverns, whatever you want to call it. How many times has someone just finally said, that's enough, get out? And so that's the story, is that Guglielmo had enough, literally pushed Nicastro out of the building. And at this moment, as the story's peaking, I have to acknowledge, just so you know, because it's very common in old newspapers, and most of these stories you can only find through old newspaper articles. I mentioned this in my first video I did. Sometimes the newspapers just get people's names wrong. I'm sure they were just playing it by ear. So all the early reports refer to this guy as being named Joseph Nicastro, and that's the name I'm going to use, even though later articles say that his name was Joseph Castronuovo. Probably Castronovo. So Nicastro, Castronovo. It's probably just a bunch of non-Italian writers just being like, just write something that sounds Italian. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the mindset. So his name might have been Joseph Castronovo. But Joseph Nicastro was the name that they were using at the start, which actually probably makes it less likely that that was his name. But anyway, Guglielmo pushes him out of the joint. As he pushes him out of the joint, Nicastro, or Castronovo, pulls I guess a whiskey flask out of his pocket, because it's the turn of the century and everybody had a whiskey flask in their pocket probably. And he hurled it at Joe Guglielmo as hard as possible. So he's in no mood to just be pushed out of this place. Fortunately, the flask didn't hit Joe Guglielmo, just hit the ground, shattered to pieces. But now that he's been physically threatened, Joe Guglielmo's really pissed. Now you've got a pissed off drunk and a pissed off bar patron, or pissed off bar proprietor, who grabs Nicastro, if that is his name again, and really just hurls him out into the street. Probably hard enough that he just threw him to the ground. Again, very common for bars, saloons, rough neighborhoods like that back in the day, because the closer you get to the river, which this is First Avenue, so, you know, the Willamette River's right over there. These first couple of blocks, kind of all through downtown, were always lined with prostitutes and rundown bars and shanty flop houses and rooming houses and things like that. And part of that's probably part of the reason why so much of this area got demolished. I mean, even back in the day, there was a lot of just flop houses and stuff around here. But for whatever the sake, Joe Guglielmo manages to finally just completely hurl Joseph Nicastro out of his saloon. Turns to go back in, probably brushes his hands off, as you do, like that takes care of that. And he barely even has the opportunity to turn around and walk back into his bar before suddenly a knife comes out of nowhere. He gets stabbed in the hand, and it's obvious that Joseph Nicastro has come back to exact drunken revenge. So, before Joe Guglielmo can even respond, even react. He's stabbed through the hand, and then he gets stabbed multiple times. They said he was stabbed altogether 5 times. So he was stabbed at least 4 times around the heart. So this was a very serious incident, and it happened like before he could even respawn. It just happened. And then Joseph Nicastro bailed out of the saloon on this block and started running towards his home, which was described as being in the Markham Gulch area, which is just kind of a couple blocks off in this direction, up over here. And this is where Frank Guglielmo comes into play, because he was there that night. They helped Joe upstairs. You know, most saloons and businesses, they were on the first floor and you had housing upstairs. A lot of proprietors just lived above their establishments. And so they took him upstairs. Frank tried to call for help, but it's 1902. You're not going to get an ambulance in 2 minutes. And he'd been stabbed around the heart. His heart had probably been penetrated. If not, you've got the lungs right there. It was very unlikely. It'd be very unlikely that someone today would survive that, even if they got immediate medical attention, if his heart was, you know, perforated, sliced, cut, whatever. He was probably bleeding to death inside and probably only lasted a few more minutes. But, you know, Frank is his son, and he did everything he could to try to get help. And I know I read in some reports afterwards that he was very critical of the local police for not taking the situation more seriously, and that he might have been saved. I think that's a bunch of hooey, in my opinion. I don't think, you know, the police could not respond as quickly as they can now. Everybody wants to, you know, somebody in their family dies, they always want to find someone to blame, understandably, in the immediate aftermath. And I think Frank Guglielmo wanted to blame the police for the murder instead of the drunken jackass that just wandered in off the street into the bar and was looking clearly for a fight. So Frank Guglielmo's father, Joe Guglielmo, perished inside the saloon that he owned right on this block of First and Market. First and Market. I don't know what the hell else I was thinking. But the story's not done, because from this saloon, the police, I mean, everybody knows it was Joseph Nicastro who did it. There were several witnesses who watched this stabbing, this brutal stabbing happen. And he bailed. He probably went right up First Avenue here, because Markham Gulch is just dead ahead. And Markham Gulch isn't what it used to be. It used to be a little bit more open, and it was predominantly residential, which obviously it's not anymore. Another casualty of 1950s and 1960s urban renewal. But yeah, Nicastro probably would have been sprinting just up this street. Same street, only it would have been 116 and a half years ago, roughly. So I'm standing by, I think this is like 3rd Avenue, maybe 4th Avenue in Carruthers, overlooking Highway 26. This is kind of the Markham Gulch area that I'm in. The Gulch, kind of where the highways drop down. It kind of was a description of this general area. And this is where, again, Joe... The more I look at my notes, the more I'm seeing Castronovo as being his name. I obviously just changed my notes writing halfway through. But anyway, I'm going with Castronovo now. I know this is confusing, but I'm going based on what I'm given. You can blame old newspaper writers from turn of the century for why I can't keep my story straight. Nicastro, now Castronovo, fled to his home in the vicinity of Markham Gulch. I never found an address, so I don't know exactly where his house was, but it was in this vicinity. And that's where he was tracked down and apprehended. And there was a lot of, if you watch the Frank Guglielmo video, literally the King of Italy contacted the city of Portland and implored us not to put Frank Guglielmo to death for the murder he committed. The King of Italy. I thought that was the craziest element to the whole story, was the fact that the guy that ran a whole country contacted Portland to tell them not to kill this one guy. And I don't think it got quite that big with Joe Guglielmo's murder, but it still caused a major rift in Portland's local Italian community, because Castronovo was also Italian, so it was one Italian killing another. So that's in old days Portland, where a lot of different people from different countries. You know, there was a German community, there was a Russian community, there was a Greek community, there was the Chinese and Japanese community living more north Portland. You know, they all had their own little pockets of the city that the preponderance of their population was living in. So when stuff like this happened, it created rifts in those small pockets of people that were, you know, from the same country, same homeland as you. And now you have to decide, like, you know, does this guy deserve to go down? He killed an Italian. He killed one of us. But the guy that did it's an Italian. Do we show him mercy because he's one of us? That has to be going around with this case, especially as Castronovo is about to go on trial. But beyond mixed feelings from the local Italian community, like almost every other murder story out there, the story that comes out first, there's always another side to the story, and that was Castronovo's side of the story. Castronovo claims that he was using a slot machine inside the saloon, and that Joe Guglielmo came out and confronted him, accused him of breaking the machine. And he said that Guglielmo brandished a revolver, and thus he, Castronovo, felt his life being threatened, and only then did he pull out a knife and defending himself 5 times into Guglielmo's body, defending himself 4 times into his heart area. And he claimed then that people had been inside the bar, people who probably knew Guglielmo, probably, you know, that's why they would be drinking in his establishment. Castronovo said that some of these guys came running out after him and tackled him and almost like were gonna try to literally beat him in the street for what he'd done. And he was able to break free, and that was his explanation for why he fled the crime scene and ran home, was he felt his life was in danger by these people that were taking in Guglielmo's saloon, and probably a little pissed that this guy just stabbed the proprietor, even though apparently he did it in self-defense. The problem with all this is people that were outside claimed to verify Castronovo's story, that people came out and attacked him. However, people that are inside the saloon, you know, they pretty much verified the original story, that Castronovo was a troublemaker, he was causing problems, and he ultimately, just out of rage, pulled his knife out and stabbed Joe Guglielmo. So you've got people saying multiple different things, but people that were right there in the saloon seem to be verifying Joe Guglielmo's side of the story. But again, I mean, there's 2 sides to this story, so it's not as open and shut as people might have thought when Castronovo was finally apprehended. But what almost still gave Castronovo that little edge was, you have 2 collections of witnesses, and they're both siding with, some are siding with Guglielmo, some are siding with Castronovo. The people outside the saloon, who are just passers-by, are vindicating Castronovo's side of the story. These are random people about town, just happen to be in that place at that time. Meanwhile, the people that are vindicating the side that suggests Joe Guglielmo wasn't all that threatening, that he didn't brandish a weapon. It seemed nobody else in the saloon verified that part of the story. So the people that were on the side of Joe Guglielmo were the people that were actually in the saloon. Now, while the people outside are just random people that probably didn't have any real connection with Castronovo, and there's no reason to lie for him, these people that were in the saloon were probably pretty close. Most of them were probably pretty close and fairly friendly with Joe Guglielmo, and would therefore have a reason to lie in his favor. So in that vein, you almost have to say that Castronovo gets the edge in this thing. However, going on trial, regardless of everything else, Castronovo would be found guilty of the murder of Joe Guglielmo, Frank Guglielmo's father, who he himself would commit murder on a 16-year-old girl just a couple years later. He was given a 12-year prison sentence. I think they probably, with how much conflict there was, I think, because it seems like this is pretty, I mean, it's an act of rage. He didn't go to the saloon that night to kill anybody, but he did act out, pull a knife and attack someone who, by all accounts, had his back turned to him. This was not a guy that was threatening him. So, by all accounts, this was a, you know, I mean, if you can say someone has the right to stab someone to death for pushing them out of the establishment that they own, I mean, if you can justify that, then yeah, you can say what this guy did wasn't that bad. But this was a fairly unprovoked attack. But with the questions that linger, the fact that he didn't go there with the cold-blooded intent to murder someone, I think that probably saved Castronovo from a life sentence or possibly the death penalty. But instead, he got himself a nice 12-year stretch in the pen. That was, you know, even in kind of the rough and tumble days back in the past, it was fairly common for juries and judges to reach compromises in trials if they really couldn't fully vindicate whether it was manslaughter, first-degree murder, you know, what have you, something in between. They would usually not bust them for, you know, something that's going to end up leading to their life being taken away, but they would give them still a pretty stiff sentence. And in the end, Castronovo, who we know did it, there wasn't a question that he had killed this man, he apparently just stood there, took the conviction and the 12-year charge, and just total stillness, completely unmoved by the verdict. Who knows if he would have been more reactive if he'd been given a life sentence or been sentenced to death for something like that. But the fact that he was convicted on the charge and given a pretty stiff sentence almost makes me want to retract and say his side of the story was a bunch of crap, because you think he would have at least had some form, even if he didn't say anything, just some form of a visual response if this guy feels his life was threatened first and therefore he protected himself. If he was so convinced that what he did was self-defense, you think he would have some kind of reaction to still going to prison for such a long stretch for something like that. But apparently he sat there in total stillness and just took it, which makes me think his side of the story was probably garbage, and he was probably lucky to get away from that situation, that very volatile situation, with a 12-year prison sentence. He probably considered himself lucky, and therefore just sat there and was like, all right, I'll take it. And that's the story of the murder of Joe Guglielmo in his saloon at First and Market, which I've done a full circle around the city, and I'm literally walking up to Second and Market right now. So I'm literally ending up practically right back where I started, because First and Market is right over there. So full circle, everything comes together. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you made it all the way through, I commend you. Thank you. And as the usual shtick goes, remember to like, share, subscribe, comment, but keep it nice. And hit up my Patreon if you so desire. Help throw a few bucks my way. Help me to do even more stuff, because it's getting harder for me to find time to do these videos when I have just so much other stuff going on and stuff that I gotta do to pay the bills, you know. But all that said, guys, till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian, right back at First and Market where I began. I didn't even plan it to end this way. But till next time, from the site of where the sunny side? Can't remember what it was called, it's been so long. Where the saloon was where Joe Guglielmo was stabbed to death. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.